Okay, well, if everyone's ready and set, we can start, and I'll pass over to Madam John to give us the introduction and move on from there.
That was great. Okay. I'm just preparing my notes. Thank you. Thank you guys for joining us for the first virtual panel co-hosted by the Conservative Friends of Afghanistan, the director who's on the line, Shabnam Nasimi, and myself, founder of Her Afghanistan. As all of us are well aware that on February 29th, U.S. Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad signed an agreement with the Taliban representative for pretty much a non-military solution in Afghanistan. At the signing ceremony, Pompeo sounded a note of caution. We will closely watch the Taliban's compliance with their commitments and calibrate the pace of our withdrawal to their actions. This week, the second week of May, US President Donald Trump stated that the United States has been in Afghanistan, and I quote, he says, for many years, we're like a police force, and at some point, they're, referring to Afghans, are going to have to be able to take care of their own country, and they're going to have to be able to police their own country. However, he ended with, so I don't know, we'll have to see. That is the key point, that the world community will have to assess the current state of Afghanistan and shape their policies to continue to eliminate or continue to combat terrorism. In recent days, I'm sure all of you are well aware, and one of our speakers is going to speak about the ground reality of the attack that happened at the hospital run by an international humanitarian organization, MSN, in Kabul, western of Afghanistan, the same day a suicide bomber attacked in Nangarhar, eastern of Afghanistan, targeting a funeral of a police commander. We've had many officials, one off the record and one on record, which includes Afghanistan's vice president, former intelligence chief Amrullah Saleh, reported evidence that the Taliban was responsible for the brutal attack on both the funeral and the maternity ward. But the facts are that nobody claimed the attack in Kabul. Only Islamic State claimed the attack at the funeral in Nangarhar. Taliban, however, made a statement that they denied any part of the attack that had taken place in Kabul. Aside from the attack, we are witnessing an increase of criminal activity, especially in Kabul. Most recently was the personal secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mohammad Hanif Atmar's personal secretary, who was shot by an unknown gunman. We are all aware that this has been occurring on a weekly basis in Kabul. Shabnam and I are honored to have the former Afghan ambassador to Canada and France, Omar Samad, Deputy Director of Asia Program at the Wilson Center, Michael Kugelman, International Development Specialist in Institutional Reform, Karen Coates, author, researcher, and consultant to UNDP, Graham Smith, an independent journalist on the ground in Kabul, Ali Latifi, and Director of CNA, Center for Stability and Development, Dr. Jonathan Schroden. I would like to begin by apologizing to our listeners for not holding a direct engagement. Questions and requests are asked to be tagged on Twitter with @Conservative Friends of Afghanistan and @Her Afghanistan. The respective panelists will then respond at their own convenience. Now, I would like to start our panel by directing to Ali Latifi, the independent journalist on the ground in Kabul, to provide what the ground reality there is. Mr. Latifi, can you please take it from here?
Sure. So the ground reality in Kabul, it's a scary time because the attack on the MSF clinic really shook people, because no one ever believed that something like, a maternity ward where there were pregnant women, where there were newborn children. I was just there yesterday, and I saw families being reunited with the babies and seeing how emotional that was. It's really taken a toll on people. On the people, but we have to remember that there's a few issues that are still ongoing. So we just had the political settlement yesterday between Dr. Abdullah and President Ashraf Ghani, which is supposed to be centered around peace. And the idea of this agreement is that, these two men both claim to be the rightful president of the country, both held inaugurations. And based on this agreement, President Ghani will continue to be the president, and Dr. Abdullah will essentially take over the entire government peace portfolio, which is something he's been very serious and very adamant about since even during the presidential elections. Throughout the presidential election process, Dr. Abdullah kept saying, if there is real peace with the Taliban, I'm willing to step down from the election and work more towards that. And the hope is that this agreement will be a way that all of the influential leaders in Afghanistan, all of the political figures can come together, and there'll even be a grand council of different political leaders who will give their opinions on matters related to peace, so that they can begin intra-Afghan talks without all of these divisions between the different political factions and figures in Afghanistan, which has been a major issue. And it's been something that the Taliban repeatedly essentially makes fun of. They keep saying, for instance, you had an election and it took 3, 4, 5 months to figure out who won. Or you had an election and you had 2 inaugurations, or your own government doesn't get along with it itself, such as the previous government when Dr. Abdullah was given the chief executive role after similar claims of fraud in that election. So the hope is that this will sort of resolve that. But what we're seeing is that the government is moving much more away from the idea of peace. For instance, what Amrullah Saleh said is that, claiming that he has evidence, but he has never actually presented that evidence clearly that the Taliban were responsible for these attacks. And to pin such an attack on any group and to say that these groups are similar or related could be quite dangerous, because the thing is, for years when there were attacks in Kabul and in other cities, and we would say no one has claimed responsibility yet, a lot of people would come out and say, well, of course it's the Taliban, who else would do it? Well, then in 2014, a group called Daesh emerged in Afghanistan, these forces claiming to be part of Daesh. And they actually have a fierce rivalry with the Taliban. So there's a lot of questions about sort of, where these 2 political leaders are headed, and whether or not there is actual seriousness, both from the Taliban side and from the government side, in terms of peace. Because we've seen in the last week, just in Paktia province alone, in Zermatt district, we saw NDS-backed forces killing civilians, and then we saw in Gardez, the capital, we saw Taliban claiming responsibility for the death of civilians. So again, what we're seeing is that despite all of these sort of political and military issues, at the end of the day, it's the Afghan people, the civilians, that are continuing to pay the price, and there's no real roadmap, it doesn't seem.
If I may, Ali, can you please give us some of the reactions from the residents in the provinces, how they are feeling about this whole process, whether it's the intra-Afghan negotiation, whether it's the political settlement, and how they feel about the current security situation. And then let's go back to Kabul. So after that question, please give me a better understanding of how the residents in Kabul are currently feeling with the security situation and the political structure.
Sure. So, in terms of sort of like this political settlement, I think everyone is at a point where they're just kind of resigned to it. In the first few months after the election and leading up to the election results, supporters of both teams, of both Dr. Abdullah and Dr. Ghani's team, wherever you went, were like, oh, we're winning. Like Dr. Abdullah is the president, or Dr. Ghani is the president. And they were both teams, both groups of supporters were very adamant that there would be no sort of agreement. There would be no power sharing. There would be no division of power. Nothing resembling a national unity government again. And now that we've seen it move closer and closer to that, the entire time, it's kind of become a joke. Like, when do we settle who becomes president? And at this point, up until today, I think people are just sort of like, okay, that's the price of having elections in Afghanistan, it seems, over the last few years. In terms of how people in the provinces are reacting to the peace sort of situation, during the ceasefire, during the week-long reduction in violence, I traveled to Nangarhar province. I went to a couple different districts, and there I saw people who were victims of night raids and drone strikes, and who were also victims of Taliban and Daesh violence. And the thing they all said is, we just want an end to this war. We really just want an end to this war. We don't want our sons to die anymore. We don't want our women to be widowed anymore. We don't want our kids to be orphaned, fatherless and motherless anymore. Like that was very, I even asked women, I said, well, what about, sort of like the issue of rights and the issue of advancement and things like that? And, they said, no one has a right to force, say, a woman to work in the home or stay outside, to go outside or stay inside. But at the same time, we just really need this war to end. We really need an end to the violence. And so there is definitely a feeling of that in a lot of places, but there's also a feeling of, look, we've come so far. We have even more rights than we did under the kingdom or under the first democracy of Muhammad Daud Khan. You know, we don't want to give those things up. So it's really become an issue of, you know, how much are you willing to fight for your rights and freedoms, you know? Or do you just really need an end to this war, to an end to this daily violence from all sides? Because I think that's something that we don't talk enough about, the fact that, you know, the US has contributed to civilian casualties, the Afghan forces have contributed to civilian casualties, the Taliban have definitely contributed to civilian casualties, and Daesh have definitely contributed to civilian casualties. And we're not really talking about these sorts of issues.
Can you please explain to us the other facet of the security sector? So you have the terror angle, but let's talk about the criminal activity that's been on the rise. So the random shootings of unknown gunmen. Can you give us some, is there a fear amongst the people? How about yourself?
I mean, there's obviously a fear of, you know, as you said, that Hani Fatmar's personal secretary was shot, right? And, you know, you have people being held up for cell phones, for money. You have people, you know, being held at gunpoint for these sorts of things. For instance, in the city of Kunduz, in the actual city of Kunduz, there has been massive increases in the last few years, especially in the last 2 years, in crime, in robbery, in armed robbery, in kidnapping. And whenever the people go, I talked to a few people in Kunduz about a year ago for this story, and they kept saying, we keep going to the police, and the police, like, they keep saying these criminals are allied with this militia commander or with this armed group or with this basically like high-powered person in Kunduz. That's why they get away with it. You know, in Herat, we've always had issues with kidnappings and with armed robbery and things like that. Jalalabad may be the one city where it's getting a little bit better compared to like 2-3 years ago. It was a major issue. It's getting a little bit better, but obviously as the economy gets worse and as more people are being able to operate with impunity, these kinds of issues are going to come up. And again, it comes down to the question of how can the police forces really protect people? Are they able to be a protective force for the population of the country?
Thank you, Alijan. Our time's up. We went over a little bit. But if you need to go, we understand, or if you please stay at the conference. Michael, thank you for joining us. Could you please provide your perspective on the current U.S.-Afghan affairs, a major challenge, and a possible recommendation to the Afghan government and their international partners?
Sure. Well, thanks, Mariam, to you and to Shabnam for the invitation, and to your respective organizations as well. It's great to be part of such a diverse and knowledgeable panel. In a nutshell, I would describe U.S.-Afghan relations at the moment as precarious, and actually, I would argue that U.S.-Afghanistan relations in the era of Ashraf Ghani have followed a somewhat similar trajectory to that followed in the Hamid Karzai era. And that's essentially lots of high hopes initially, followed by a lot of disappointments later. You know, I mean, you'll remember that at one point, Hamid Karzai was the favorite son of Washington. He was Washington's man in Kabul after 9/11, leading up to after the Bonn conference that established the post-Taliban government. The George W. Bush administration thought very highly of him because he was perceived as charismatic, cosmopolitan, and a great ally. But then the relationship went sour quite quickly, and it really sunk during the Obama years. With President Ghani, there's been somewhat of a similar dynamic. Initially, there were high hopes in DC that Ghani would be a different kind of leader, someone who had worked in DC at the World Bank for many years, who had literally written the book on fixing failed states, and who seemed genuinely invested in fighting corruption. And many in Washington at that time knew him personally. They were on a first-name basis with him, and they were able to personally vouch for his credibility. And yet now, you know, the bilateral relationship is shaky, especially amid rising U.S. impatience and frustration, driven in great part by the inability of Kabul to launch a formal peace process following the signing of the U.S. Taliban deal with nearly 3 months ago. And certainly the bilateral relationship is nowhere near as troubled now as it was during the last few years of the Obama administration working with Karzai, when senior U.S. officials were literally having shouting sessions with him. But the current relationship is in a precarious place. And I think that the biggest takeaway for U.S.-Afghan relations right now is that the Trump administration is committed to having its troops head for the exits, and it badly, badly wants peace talks to begin between the Afghan government and the Taliban so that the U.S. withdrawal will look like a graceful departure more than a humiliating surrender. And I think the writing is starting to appear on the wall in the sense that the U.S. government is increasingly telegraphing public messages to Kabul that it's essentially going to be on its own in a matter of time. Mariam, you mentioned at the beginning of your introductory comments the comments that President Trump made last Tuesday, the day of those horrific attacks in Afghanistan, in which he basically said he didn't know much about the attacks. He said that the U.S. is not a police force, and that the government in Afghanistan needs to take care of its own affairs, in essence. And then, even more explicit was a comment from the U.S. National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, that same day, last Tuesday, the day of those horrific attacks, in which he said, it's now time for the Afghan people to get together, to enter into a meaningful peace process, and it's time for America to come home. We've got a lot to focus on here. And then around the same time, you had a statement from Secretary of State Pompeo, in which he essentially called on the Taliban and the Afghan government to work together to track down the perpetrators of the attacks last Tuesday. He did not call on the US government to work with the Taliban and the Afghan government in that regard. So again, an implication of, you're increasingly on your own. Then there was a tweet from Ambassador Khalilzad last week in which he said that Afghans have to come together and forge a historic peace, no excuses. Those are his words. It's essentially a quote. So again, no mention of US involvement. I'm not saying here that the U.S. is simply giving up and that it wants to disengage with Kabul. Far from it. Yesterday, after the Abdullah Ghani power sharing deal had been concluded, Khalilzad sent out another tweet in which he basically said that the U.S. looks forward to partnering with the Afghan government in pursuing peace. But overall, the tenor of recent comments of senior U.S. officials, I think, is noticeably different from the messaging from just a few weeks or even a few months ago. So looking to the future, I think there's fairly strong bipartisan support in the U.S. for withdrawing forces from Afghanistan. I mean, and of course, the U.S. Taliban deal states that all U.S. troops will be out of Afghanistan by the end of April 2021, 14 months after the signing of that deal, if the U.S. believes that the Taliban has fulfilled its commitments laid out in the deal. Of course, by then, May of next year, there will be a new U.S. administration, either Trump 2.0 or Joe Biden. But I would argue that whichever government, whoever is in the White House by next spring, is not likely to be that hard on the Taliban in terms of holding it to its commitments, and it will be very likely to complete a troop withdrawal. So I think what this means is that the question of future U.S. financial assistance to the Afghan state will become quite key, especially if, as is likely, the Taliban continues to fight amid and after a U.S. troop withdrawal. Maybe one could argue that the Afghan government would be able to keep things together after U.S. forces have left. But if the U.S. pulls the plug on financial support, and particularly for the ANSF, that could pose very significant challenges for Afghanistan. So to conclude, I'll offer a short and a long-term recommendation for the U.S. and for the Afghan governments. I think in the near term, before the U.S. election, the U.S. and Afghan governments need to figure out a way to get back on the same page. Over the last few days, they've essentially been blaming different groups for the recent attacks. Washington is really pushing Kabul hard to double down on a peace process that Kabul may hesitate to begin, at least in the near term. And in the longer term, after the U.S. election, when you have a new U.S. government, I think there needs to be a serious conversation between the U.S. and Afghan governments and the donor community more broadly, looking at what the aid regime will look like moving forward, and especially looking to the inevitable day when there no longer is a U.S. military presence in Afghanistan. I imagine that many donors will be uncomfortable providing sustained financial assistance to Afghanistan if there's no U.S. or very little U.S. or broader NATO security presence on the ground. And I think the challenge for Afghanistan will be how to make the case against the backdrop of donor fatigue and also a post-pandemic economic crisis, how to make the case that it deserves that continued assistance. So thank you. I'll stop there.
Perfect timing, right at 7 minutes. Thank you, Michael. Dr. Schroden, thank you for joining us. Could you please highlight the security challenges that the current state of affairs in Afghanistan will hold on the world community and a possible recommendation to the Afghan government and their international partners?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Mariam, and thank you, Shabnam, for having me. It's always good to be on a panel with some familiar faces that I enjoy hearing from as well. I especially appreciate Ali Latifi's perspective from inside Kabul. It's great to have a panelist speaking directly from there to get that feel on the ground. So thank you for that. In terms of the security situation in Afghanistan and some recommendations to address that, I thought I'd just touch on a few points. One is to recognize that the strategy that Taliban have been following over the last decade or so is really a repeat of the strategy of each of the modern insurgencies in Afghanistan, which is to say they pursue what you could describe as an outside-in approach, where they use the sort of safe havens that they enjoy in Pakistan, especially to project power initially into Afghanistan in its most rural areas. They then consolidate control of those rural areas and use them to generate resources and manpower to increasingly project power into ever more populated areas. And so you've seen that play out over the last 10 years or so, really 10 to 15 years in Afghanistan, as the Taliban have increasingly seized rural areas and then used them to encroach on, the cities. And so if you look today, right, according to the most recent public estimates by the Long War Journal, which is the only remaining estimate of this type since the U.S. government stopped tracking these types of statistics, or at least releasing them publicly, their data show that the Taliban have outright control of about 20% of Afghanistan's districts right now, and they control significant areas of about another 50% of the districts. And so while the government still controls all of the major cities, if you look at the areas that the Taliban currently control, at least a half a dozen of the major cities in Afghanistan are nearly surrounded by Taliban-controlled areas. And so you have a situation where they are on the verge of being able to lay siege to a number of significant populated areas, and they're able to regularly sever some of the major roadways in Afghanistan as well. And so that's sort of the situation that you see on the Taliban side, is this erosion of state security, across the country, again, from an outside-in perspective. And when you look at Afghanistan's security forces, it's a tale of two forces, really. You have the Air Force and the commandos, the Afghan Special Security Forces, which are quite capable, especially relative to regional forces. They are among some of the more capable equivalent forces within the region, and they continue to develop and improve their capabilities over time, largely because the U.S. has invested consistent amounts of funding, training, and it has established relationships with those units with U.S. partner units that are consistent. So you have the same U.S. partner unit rotating its forces in and out to train with the Air Force as well as the commandos. And so you have these sustained investment and relationships that have resulted in those forces being largely very capable. But then if you look at the Army and the police force, it's a completely different story, right? The Afghan Army has been chronically undermanned by at least 10 to 15%, even on paper. And if you look at, in terms of how many soldiers are actually showing up on any given day to conduct security operations, the percentage is at least double, if not 3 times that shortfall on a day-to-day basis in terms of the amount of manpower the Army is able to field. And if you look at the police force, right? The U.S. effectively gave up on Afghanistan's police force a number of years ago. They tried to make it a paramilitary force that could, engage the Taliban and other elements in rural areas and try and disrupt the Taliban strategy there. That has largely failed, due in large part because of the police force being not designed to be a paramilitary. It's not trained, it's not equipped. That's not what its forces signed up to be. And so it has largely been on the forefront of the suffering and casualties that the Taliban has inflicted on Afghanistan's security forces over the last few years. The police have suffered just horrendous numbers of casualties over the last 3, 4, 5 years. And so when I think about recommendations to address those types of issues, I would offer 3. And I would say that I would still offer these even in the context of the peace process and the negotiations that have been described by Michael, and I'm sure will be addressed by other panelists as well, in part because my personal belief is those negotiations are likely to take some matter of years in order to reach fruition, if they even do. And so during that time, there's unfortunately going to be continued fighting, especially in rural areas. And so, reform of Afghanistan's security forces to be effective in that regard and to provide the government a stronger hand in those negotiations is still needed, even in the context of those negotiations. So I would offer 3 recommendations to that end. The first is, frankly, right, just speaking frankly about it, the leaders of Afghanistan's security forces, and here I mean at all echelons, from tactical to strategic level leaders, especially when it comes to the army and the police, have to stop stealing the funds, food, fuel, and ammunition that is being purchased and provided for the Afghan security forces. Corruption in the forces, especially among its leadership, is still a huge problem, and it significantly undermines the fighting ability of those forces in the field. So that has to be addressed. The Afghan government has got to get its arms around that and start taking that more seriously than it has. The second recommendation I would make is much more emphasis, I think, needs to be placed on recruiting for the army. Part of the reason the Taliban have been able to continually take more rural territory in recent years and hold that territory and use it to threaten the cities is that the Afghan army is significantly short of manpower. And this is for reasons that I've never fully understood, not become a priority of the US mission in Afghanistan, nor of the Afghan government. But getting the army to 100% manning, I would argue, should be a priority and needs renewed focus over the next year or 2. And then the third thing I would offer is the police force in Afghanistan needs to be completely reformed. I would say that the country currently has too many different types of police. There's at least a half a dozen, if not 8 or 9 different flavors of police that you could point to, which is inherently inefficient and creates all kinds of seams and ineffective aspects of the force. And its police forces are not being used properly across the country. As I said, they're largely used as paramilitaries, even though they're not trained or equipped to do that effectively. And so I would offer that as the country thinks about police reforms, which are long overdue, that it really needs to look at 2 major types of forces. One would be a provincial police force that could operate effectively as a paramilitary force in rural areas and along major roadways to try and disrupt what the Taliban is doing out there. And a city police force that would operate inside largely more populated areas in accordance with the community policing models that are used throughout the world and have been established as best practice models for that type of policing. So those are the recommendations I would offer. And again, thank you, Mariam, thank you, Shabnam, for the opportunity to offer them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schroden. That was a great segue into the security sector and the recommendations that you've provided. Let's turn to foreign policy. Ambassador Samad, thank you for joining us. We are eager to hear your perspective on the foreign policy challenges Afghanistan is facing, and what is your recommendation to the Afghan government and their international partners?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mariam. Thank you, Shabnam, and great to be in great company with everyone. It's a broad question as far as challenges are concerned. Unfortunately, Afghanistan has many foreign policy challenges directly tied to these following sectors, in my opinion. Number one, obviously, is security. Security has different facets, one being domestic, the other being defense of the country, and anti-terrorism, obviously a major component. The other one is geopolitical pressures. I mean, we can talk about these things further later on, but I think that's an important part of a challenge for Afghan foreign policy. The economy is a major part of the Afghan foreign policy issues because it covers trade, transit, aid, development, funding, and even investment. Obviously, we also have challenges with refugee repatriation and resettlement. We have challenges with water sharing issues with some of our neighbors. There are challenges that have to do with the narcotics segment and the transnational criminal and smuggling activities that Afghanistan has issues with. We also have foreign policy challenges that go back to unresolved historic and border issues. And I think that sometimes we ignore them, whereas they are part of the challenges we face. And obviously nowadays, we have the challenge of the threat of pandemics, such as the current coronavirus going around. But let me also add to that, that in terms of a critical on-off process, which sort of supersedes and could impact all the other challenges, we have obviously the peace process itself. And the peace process, which means a quest for ending the conflict and pursuing a path for reconciliation and a political settlement, involves on one hand the Taliban, so we hope at some point, and on the other hand, this post-2001 Islamic Republic order that has been put together, which has gone through all kinds of different issues lately. And we saw yesterday the new agreement that was signed. And I think that the alternate to peace would be a default to status quo, which means more fighting, in a different version of what we have seen happen over the last, let's say, 15 years when the Taliban came back on the scene. We also cannot ignore the fact that there are some drivers and factors affecting Afghanistan's stability overall, and foreign and security and economic strategy in particular, that are very much rooted in geography and in history, as I mentioned earlier, and also external geopolitical and geoeconomic pressures and tensions and rivalries. Underdevelopment, Afghanistan's underdevelopment is a major factor, and it all manifests itself in the form of acute dependency on foreign aid. And also what we have seen over the past 20 years at least, if not 40 or so, is a dysfunctional political system that has for a long time shifted and sort of swung from, let's see, an absolute monarchy 50 years ago to a constitutional and progressive monarchy, to an authoritarian Republican regime, to a Marxist-Leninist utopia, to different shades of Islamism, including Talibanism, and finally, since 2002 or so, a constitutional republic that has been itself experiencing highs and lows in terms of serious inclusivity and legitimacy problems. So those are some of the, I think, the challenges that Afghan foreign policy overall faces. And you asked me also to give some recommendations. Now, again, in general terms, as someone who's worked in the foreign policy establishment of Afghanistan for the past 20 years, I think that we first need to professionalize the institutions that run foreign policy. We need to bring together a core policy planning group of experienced practitioners and thinkers to help, the government and the executive with their decisions and planning. We also need to prioritize and adjust foreign policy focus and issues. We sometimes are a bit behind or sometimes we're way ahead of everybody else on issues that may not be totally factual. Right now, there's this big question as to whether it's Daesh or it's Taliban or it's something in between that is attacking certain targets, soft targets. We need to base everything on facts and evidence. Um, we also, I think, need to have a policy that reduces tensions with our neighbors. And we need to address some of the contentious issues that we have had for years and find solutions that are practical. Now, as far as the peace and the political settlement track is concerned, it's going to be a major driver of foreign policy from here on. And now with Dr. Abdullah sort of having been given that responsibility, obviously with everyone else on board as well, because it's supposed to be an inclusive process. And with the executive now in the hands of President Ghani, they will have to find ways to coordinate. They will have to find ways to cooperate in order to push the peace process towards a certain objective that they all agree on. We cannot have more dissension and more division when it comes to the next steps of the peace process if we want it to materialize into a settlement. I think this is going to be very important. And something else that other people have mentioned, other people here, this whole issue of funding, this whole issue of dependency that Afghanistan has been facing for if not centuries, decades. We right now have almost a budget that is somewhere between 60 to 70% dependent on foreign assistance. We need to, as far as the future is concerned, and especially if there's a peace dividend that is coming up, we need to think about how to make sure that we have a funding stream, that we also make good use of the funding stream and prioritize better than how we've done it over the past 20 years or so. So anyway, I will stop here because there's a lot that can go into this, and I hope we can follow the discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think that giving this general perspective, especially for our viewers, is very important because usually when we have professionals, they just give a specific a fraction of it, and the holistic perspective, especially when we're providing recommendation to international partners in the Afghan government, is very important. It seems that the order is really, it's working into one another. Graham, thank you for joining us. You have been following the peace process from before it even sort of become a process. Please share an obstacle that everyone seems to miss. What I'm trying to say is that we don't want to continue to emphasize on the importance of holding the intra-Afghan negotiations or the prisoner exchange. What else could you highlight for us? And after the highlight, please do share your recommendations to the Afghan government and their international partners.
I think in some ways the biggest obstacle is emotional. It's coming around in our hearts to this idea that we're not going to win on the battlefield. We, the West, the Afghan government, that this conflict will end in a negotiation, ideally, and that has far-reaching implications. And it's something I think that a lot of folks haven't really come around to yet. I was on the phone last night with Afghan government official who's involved in the peace process, and I was trying to make some of the same points to him that you've heard so far on the panel. When Michael talks about donor fatigue, and especially American patients thinning with Kabul, I don't think that has really sunk in Kabul, the degree to which the Americans, both Democrat and Republican, really want to get out. And I don't think everyone has really absorbed what Michael was saying about the need to make a case for continued funding for Afghanistan in general. It's just not when you have conversations with people in Kabul, they still think that the foreigners' money is going to flow forever. And I think especially post-COVID, that's just not the case. And the other point I was trying to make to him was what Jonathan is saying, is that the sort of military envelope in which all of this is happening it's a shrinking space. SIGAR doesn't release anymore any data about the U.S. military view of that shrinking space, but we all know it's a shrinking space. And the important takeaway from what Jonathan was describing in terms of the facts on the ground is that the Taliban do have a military option. That if they want to, the Taliban could continue fighting. That's available to them. And they might even have a shot at taking some urban areas, maybe even the capital. On the government side, the options are more constrained because when the foreigners pay for your military and the foreigners don't want to pay for it anymore, you run out of choices. And so that asymmetry affects what can be achieved through negotiations. And as Ambassador Samad very correctly said, the only alternative to peace is that eroding status quo. And it's a terrible status quo. I mean, by one estimate, 40,000 Afghans were killed in battle last year. That is a terrible death toll. That makes Afghanistan the worst conflict on the planet Earth. It's worse than Syria. It's worse than Yemen. I mean, it is an unacceptable level of carnage, as we saw last week, and it has to end. And so the status quo is not really viable. It's a burning platform. You have to leap from a burning platform at some point. And I think the conversation that I was having with my friend, we were talking about the rate of prisoner releases. And he was arguing that maybe it's in the interest of the government to do a sort of a slowly approach with the prisoner releases. Okay, now Abdullah is in charge of the peace file. Maybe, it's going to take Abdullah some time to set up his new administration. Will he decide to keep the existing negotiating team or not? Basically suggesting that considering all the uncertainty and the incredible risks, I mean, it's a very risky thing going into a peace process. So considering those terrible political risks, that maybe the government would be well advised to just step cautiously into these troubled waters of a peace process. And I understood his argument. I understood why you would want to be nervous about going into such an uncertain situation. But my counter argument to him was that, look, things on your side are not necessarily going to get a lot better than this, a lot better than they are today. I mean, the trend in the conflict, I mean, I'm just an analyst. I just look at the graphs. I have no crystal ball, but look, the levels of violence keep going up. The level of, the amount of territory under government control keeps going down. So, I'm just, as an outsider, I would recommend very humbly that you might want to negotiate now rather than when you are weaker later on. Because if you negotiate when you are stronger, you are likely to get a better deal. But, I'm just a foreigner. And I see in the comments a comment from Vasima saying, the panel excludes Afghans, bringing only diaspora and foreigners. None of them live in Afghanistan. And that's absolutely correct. And I think that we're likely to see more anger from Kabul, especially from the people who believed the West when we came to Afghanistan and said, we're here to stay and we're here to win. And neither of those things proved to be true. And so it is true, the America and its allies are looking for Plan B options now in Afghanistan. And is that a betrayal? Yes, it's a betrayal. And, I think a lot of people are going to be angry. And so I think as foreigners, as I'm a consultant, as experts, we should be really humble about the mistakes that have been made. And that should make us very, very cautious about how we make our recommendations in the future.
Thank you, Graham. Do you have anything else that you would like to recommend, or are we, because you're ended earlier than everybody else?
Well, like I said, it's not theoretically the recommendations that I would make. It's like the recommendation that I was making very forcefully yesterday to the government was, you need to go ahead and reach 5,000 prisoner releases, because frankly, that's the deal. And going ahead with this deal, as flawed as it may be, is probably your best strategic option right now.
Thank you so much, Graham. Moving right along, can we please have Karen? Karen, pleasure to have you here with us. Your experience in Afghanistan ranges from working with the disabled to provincial programs and institutional reforms. How will development in Afghanistan suffer in the foreseeable future, or will it not suffer? What are your recommendations to the Afghan government and international partners?
Thank you so much, Mariam and Shabnam. It's great to be with you all today and with the panel. I think that is the question. Obviously, development in Afghanistan will change. Whether or not it suffers, I think is still a little bit up for discussion. And so some of what I wanted to talk about is maybe things we ought to be focusing on to do what we can to take every opportunity to see that it doesn't suffer, because we know that those who will be most impacted by that, of course, are Afghan citizens. I think, as the other panelists have so aptly described, economic needs, security needs of the Afghan citizens of the state are clearly increasing, even at the same time as global economic trends, as political realities mean that the resources to help Afghanistan meet those needs are going to decrease. And I think it's important to take a serious look at that and not have too high expectations of the type of resources that will be going to Afghanistan in the sort of near to medium future. So of course, increased needs, decreased resources, the challenge is how to use those remaining resources as strategically and as effectively as we can, both the international partners and the Afghan government. But I think the struggle with development is that, of course, as we know, using resources strategically and efficiently is not always something that governments do best or that donors do best. We have lots and lots of examples of what's gone wrong with development in Afghanistan over the years. They've been well documented, and so I won't repeat those here. I think you can look at any number of recent documents or talk to anyone, Afghan or international, who's spent any time in Afghanistan and with development programs to see a lot of the same themes of challenges and difficulties. What's gone wrong isn't necessarily the question, it's more why it's so persistently going wrong and why it's been so hard to change. And so what can we do now to try to shift that curve? So I think two things that are on my mind as we look ahead to development. One is that with decreasing resources, how do we make sure that we're strategically using the different forms and the different mechanisms of development that we have? I think one thing that we see a lot of is that either we demonize or we idolize what development can do. And international development has done some harm in Afghanistan, but it's not the sole cause of Afghanistan's problems. It's also done a lot of good in Afghanistan, but it's also not going to be the savior or the sole solution of Afghanistan's problems either. It's one set of tools and one set of mechanisms that should be used by both internationals and by the Afghan government very strategically to address problems. Kind of a caveat is that when we talk about international development, of course, it can mean any number of things. It's used as a term quite often in Afghanistan to encompass everything from nonprofits to for-profits, civilian, military, humanitarian and development and peace-building activities, kind of all of those things combined. There's a time and a place to kind of parse out those different definitions and talk about the pros and cons of each. But I think often I see that being done in order to sort of pick one that's best or assume that we have to use kind of one type. On budget, off budget, public, private, that type of thing. Whereas I think the reality is that we are always going to need these different kinds of tools in Afghanistan because they're good at doing different things. They each bring something to the table. And so I think instead of looking at sort of all the different types in order to to exclude some or to glorify others. It's probably more accurate to look at how we can sort of start instead from the problem that we have, work backwards and see exactly what kind of funding, what kind of mechanisms, what kind of implementation is going to be best to solve that problem. Usually we do it from the other way around. As donors or as international partners, we say, okay, we have this kind of money from this kind of donor agency. We're comfortable working with this kind of implementing partner. And so that really drives how development support is given to Afghanistan, as opposed to flipping it around and looking at the context on the ground and seeing, okay, which type of tool is going to be best to address this problem. And so I think ideally this leads to spaces where discussions about, everything from security sector development to governance to private sector economic development, social development can mingle together so that we can learn from the mistakes that have been made and from the achievements that have been made of the other. As the panelists have been talking, we have examples in everyone's comments of, things that work well in security sector development, things that don't, things that work well in private sector development, things that don't. And I think often we get so siloed into the different sectors that we miss the trick of being able to learn from one another about those things. I think as the resources dwindle, if we're not very strategic in terms of taking advantage of that wealth of knowledge and taking advantage of things across sectors, the cost for the Afghan public is going to be exacerbated if we're not strategic with the dwindling resources that we do have. Of course, in order to do this, which brings me to kind of my second theme, we know that it takes a level of collaboration, coordination that we don't often see. Takes a lot of laying down of our egos, a lot of humility, as has been discussed, and that's hard. It's hard to imagine sort of humanitarians taking lessons from military and vice versa. It's hard to imagine nations letting another nation take the lead in a certain sector, or international actors submitting to Afghan government ownership of certain things. We see glimpses of it over the years, but I am actually cautiously optimistic that this could increase or could improve in Afghanistan. And it's not necessarily because I'm an optimist, but because what I've seen so far in Afghanistan is that, ironically, it's the countries with the least amount of money, it's the lowest budget projects, it's the least politically powerful stakeholders that tend to be the best at cooperation and collaboration. As the resources dwindle, we find ourselves with problems that are more complex than what we can handle on our own. And often that does force us towards better prioritization and better collaboration. And so while we'd hope that we would do it willingly, an open question for me is whether or not the decrease in resources might force us to a table that we've been resisting for the last couple of years. We face a lot of problems now in Afghanistan that are increasingly complex. They're very political. They cross different sectors. They're not the kind of problems, before there were some problems that were more one-dimensional. We could maybe work on solving them with a training or an infrastructure project or something kind of one-dimensional. But these days, a lot of the challenges that are left, as the panelists have described, they're massively complex. They're wicked problems. They cross sectors of politics and the economy and education, security and social change. And over the past 20 years, even before that, development has made improvements in some of these sectors, but they're not very sustainable, often because they don't link to improvements in multiple sectors at the same time. And so you have these kind of flares and these pockets of success that often we don't see lasting or sustainable because we weren't very good at prioritizing and tackling problems with solutions in multiple sectors over time. So I think if we're not going to get better at prioritizing, coordinating the aid streams and collaborating together, our inputs, they're likely to continue to be spread very thin as the resources decline over a lot of different sectors, which is not as likely to result in something concrete and tangible and lasting, something that feels like a solved problem for the Afghan government and the Afghan people. And so I think, I think the Afghan government really needs to be able to step up and take the lead in really assessing and prioritizing where it does and where it doesn't need international assistance. There might be areas where it feels like support is still needed, But in terms of funding, in terms of expertise, are there areas where Afghans can take the lead from here and continue to develop solutions for things on their own? And are there other areas where it's so critical that we get it right, that maybe there is still the need for the prioritized international support there? Rather than take offense at that process or try to drive that process inappropriately, I think the international community needs to be able to learn how to, with humility, to empower and support that process and that analysis, and to actually let it influence its decisions and its development agenda, which is easier said than done.
Karen.
So
I have to cut you off because we are at 9.5 minutes here. We do have, first of all, I would like to thank all of my panelists. You guys are all here speaking on Afghanistan because you guys care for Afghanistan. You have a personal investment in the country. We do have Ali here from Kabul. We have Ambassador Samad with decades of experience working in Afghanistan and representing Afghanistan to the international world. We have Michael Kugelman, who represents South Asia at the Wilson Center, constantly speaks for Afghanistan on international platforms. So what are the best interests for the Afghan-US relations? We have Graham that continues to push for peaceful efforts, and sometimes I feel that he pushes for Afghanistan more than he pushes for any other nation. Dr. Schroden, I think that your recommendations were completely on point. This is what the panel discussions here. I hope that none of the comments from our viewers have offended anybody. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but this panel was here to provide recommendations to the Afghan government on what we find based on the ground reality from Ali Latifi, on what we find that would be the best solutions for them moving forward. And that's because we have a personal interest. So again, thank you. Shabnam from Conservative Friends from Afghanistan will briefly share your recommendation as we will publish this into a document and present it to the Afghan government and their international partners. Shabnam, the floor is yours.
I'm on mute. There we go. That's fixed. Thank you, Madam John, for that detailed analysis of the situation from what we've heard on the news and the media, and also to our distinguished panelists for their contribution from their experience of working in Afghanistan, or researching and analyzing from outside. We do appreciate the time and effort that you've given to be able to look at a way forward for Afghanistan. And like Madam John has mentioned, this wasn't a interactive session where we can get where we would have been able to take questions from the audience, but I would like to thank the audience for participating as well, and at least allowing us to think of other areas that we may have not highlighted during this discussion, and hopefully they can continue their comments on Twitter by tagging Her Afghanistan or CF of Afghanistan and some of our panelists, and they may be able to directly respond to you. In regards to sort of the aims of today's discussion, the aim has been to compile a set of recommendations for a way forward. And the aim behind this has been, over the last few weeks, as many of you have seen, the increased death toll and horrific incidents that have carried on during the global pandemic that Afghanistan is now facing during the month of Ramadan, and yet the Afghans don't seem to find any way out. And it is incredibly tragic that after 20 years, we're still in a position where a lot of the infrastructure, a lot of the systems are not developed enough to stand on its own. And so with recommendations from experts on the field, hopefully we'll be able to contribute something to international partners, donors, and the government to be able to see it from a different perspective moving forward. And you know, the only way we can try to bring some sort of change or to be able to support the process the peace process and the reconstruction and development process is to be able to use a collective wealth of knowledge and understanding and use that expertise to influence change in Afghanistan. And so I will briefly go through some of the recommendations that you've mentioned. Please feel free to let me know if I've made a mistake or if you'd like to add anything to it, and we'll keep it as brief as we can. And then once we've done this, we will then be producing a report that will hopefully come out in the next few days and will be sent out to everyone. So first of all, thank you, Ali John from Kabul, for providing us a very in-depth analysis as to both the political side and the political settlement between the two leaders and the frustrations that the people of Afghanistan have faced, but also the ground reality of what this impact has had on people's lives. So thank you so much for stepping in and giving us that outlook. Michael Kugelman, thank you so much again for participating in another one of Conservative Friends of Afghanistan panel discussions. You've highlighted the relationship between the US and Afghanistan over the last 20 years very well, in terms of the strains, the highs and the lows, the relation between Karzai and now Ashraf Ghani. And some of the recommendations that you mentioned, first of all, was that whoever that the US and Afghan government need to be able to figure out a way to get back on the same page, which doesn't seem evident yet. And the second being that there needs to be some serious conversations between the two governments, donor and the donor community, looking at what aid will look like post withdrawal, and also once the reality of the impact of the coronavirus is seen in Afghanistan, especially considering that there will be no there will be a diminish in terms of the NATO US presence, what aid will look like from then on. Jonathan, thank you again as well for providing us a very detailed analysis of the security situation in Afghanistan. Sometimes we don't tend to look as much into detail as possible into how Afghanistan and the military and the police force can become self-sufficient to ensure that post-withdrawal that we are able to look after ourselves, and that's not the case. And over the last 20 years, that hasn't happened, which is quite unfortunate. And as a result, we're facing what we're facing today with the countless attacks. And some of the recommendations that you made was, first of all, that leaders of Afghanistan, the security forces, have to stop. The leader of Afghanistan have to stop stealing funds from Afghan security forces, as corruption has been a huge problem, and it does undermine and diminish the work. Much more emphasis needs to be put on the army, on recruiting for the army. Significantly present over the last 20 years, there has been a shortfall of manpower, and there hasn't been much focus on that. And so priority needs to be made, needs to be put on that area. The other was that the police force needs to completely be reformed. There are currently about 8 to 9 different types of police forces, and they're not being used properly, particularly around the fact that the police are being used as paramilitary, even though they've not received any training, and also an emphasis of the different types of police force. One would being the provincial police force used for paramilitary, and a city police force operating in populated areas, and using models from around the world. Omar Samad, Sib, thank you so much for joining us. You have a wealth of working with, of experience of working with the Afghan government and with international partners. And some of the recommendations that you've made around foreign policy has been professionalizing the institutions around foreign policy. And that means that being able to use more planning groups or experts or advisors that are that have particularly worked in that field, to be able to professionalize the institution moving forward, and to be able to use information based on facts and evidence. You've also mentioned that we need to work on some sort of policy that reduces the tensions with neighbors, which hasn't again taken place over the last couple of years. And we need some practical solutions to be able to work in partnership with our neighbors to end this conflict. And finally, thinking about how, again, on the emphasis on aid and funding, and how we prioritize the limited resources that we have presently, and also moving forward with the decrease and the reduction in funding, how we begin to become at least to some level self-sufficient. Graham, again, thank you so much. I know you come from a more analytical and academic and research background, and there were a few comments about the fact that there's a distinction between actually working in Afghanistan and living there and providing a more academic or research perspective. But I do agree completely that what the analysis that you've given in terms of the fact that Afghanistan last year has a death toll of over 40,000, which is the worst in the world. And we don't see that in the media. We don't hear about it. And sadly, to some levels, it is incredibly frustrating that people feel that Afghanistan has already started to be forgotten. We don't hear about the fact that it's the worst place to live in the world, and the attacks and the death toll is, compared to Syria and Yemen, is extraordinary. And one of the main recommendations you've made is that it needs to happen now. The negotiations need to take place now rather than later, because the weaker the state and the government becomes, there isn't much that we can negotiate with. And presently, there is a bigger proportion of Afghanistan that the Taliban already control, and as we move forward, that might increase. Karen, finally, again, thank you so much on your international development analysis, mainly focusing on resources and aid. You've very clearly outlined the challenges that the Afghan government have faced over the last 20 years, and that is the lack of partnership and lack of collaboration of working with other organizations and other experts in delivering or implementing certain projects. And one of the areas that you mentioned is possibly with the withdrawal, maybe this is the chance for Afghans to start thinking about sustainability and possibly using a different implementation or mechanism to ensure that the funding goes a longer way. And I hope that's, I'm assuming I've sort of rounded up in terms of your recommendation, but it seemed like you were particularly talking about more partnership, more collaboration, and ensuring that we use, that we start to think about new priorities, looking at what the Afghan government needs international assistance to build on, and what they can work on independently, and possibly rearranging and looking at redistributing resources that will ensure that it goes a longer way moving forward. So I think that's the brief summary. I've tried to keep it as concise as possible, but we will be writing a more detailed report which will provide a lot more of what you've mentioned. If there's anything that I've that I haven't taken down, please either let me know now, or you can email us, and we will ensure that it does come across, we are able to highlight it in the recommendation report. I won't take any more of your time. Again, thank you so much for the time that you've given us and the recommendations. Hopefully this will bring a new perspective of where Afghanistan will be going in the next couple of years, and particularly with the negotiations and the intra-Afghan dialogue. But it's incredibly important that we feed into the process and we provide as much expertise and knowledge as possible in the next coming years, because it is incredibly important. But thank you so much. And yeah, if anyone else doesn't have anything else to say, I think we can end it here.